Father Thornton's Visitor by W J Wintle. Read by Bethina. Father Thornton was a hard-headed Yorkshireman with no nonsense about him. He had just been placed in charge of the parish of Dashden and was feeling his way cautiously at first. The people did not know much of him as yet, but what little they knew they liked, and the same might be said of his feeling towards them. There were not many Catholics in Dashden, and most of Father Thornton's flock were scattered over the surrounding country. Hence he had plenty of work in visiting them. There was no lack of exercise for the legs of the priest, who had often to tramp for miles over the moors to visit one sick case. Night calls in winter or in bad weather were the chief cross that he had to bear. The late priest, who had died at his post at an advanced age, had scarcely been able to keep pace with the work, and so things had grown a little slack. He had been there for many years, and nearly all the congregation had been baptized in infancy by him. But though there had been no change of priest for so many years, the same could not be said of the priest's housekeepers. They had been constantly coming and going, and this was a subject of much gossip and curiosity in Dashden. Why did they never stop? It could not be that the old priest was hard to get on with, for he was the kindest of men, and his requirements were few and simple. His explanation was confined to 2 words: women's fads. Their explanation, when they vouchsafed to give one, was that they had nothing to complain about, but that they could not feel at home in the house. They said there was something queer about it, but what that something was, they could never clearly explain. So, in a mild sort of way, the priest's house had the reputation of being haunted, but no details could be ascertained. There was, however, a vague rumour that the site of the house had once been occupied by an old farmhouse, where a man had lived who was supposed to have refused to let the priest be fetched when his wife was dying, and from this arose the suggestion that his ghost walked on the anniversary of the woman's death. But the old priest laughed at the story, and none of the departing housekeepers ever pretended to have seen anything. That was the story that Father Thornton was told, and he gave it just the attention that it seemed to deserve. That is, none at all. Haunted or not, the house was a pleasant one. The church was the last building as you leave the little town on the south side, and the house was built on the side remote from the town, so it faced the open country, and from its windows you had an uninterrupted view across the moors for several miles to the hills in the far distance. And the garden was a thing of delight as well. It was extensive and had been the pride and chief recreation of the old priest, under whose skilful care it had become one of the pleasantest sights of the neighbourhood. Not that the general public saw anything of it, for it was enclosed by a high wall on the side bordering the road. On the inner side of this wall, which caught the sun, flourishing fruit trees had been trained at intervals. Much skill had been displayed in the arrangement of the garden. Its main purpose was usefulness, and so I suppose it must be called a kitchen garden. But no flower garden devoted to ornament alone could have been more pleasant to look upon. It might have been described as a vegetable garden disguised as a flower garden. And the disguise was a successful one. Flowers and vegetables were so skilfully intermingled that the whole effect was one of beauty. No detail had been overlooked. Even the rubbish heap in the corner was hidden by a rockery and alpine garden, and the story went that the bishop, who was a trifle short-sighted, had remarked that it was a pity that the rector grew no vegetables for the table when he had so much space. It was Father Thornton's chief delight to sit in the garden with a book or to pace its walks while he said his office. He even made up his mind to take up gardening seriously, though the pursuit had never appealed to him before. His first act on rising was to look out of his window at the garden, and his last act at night, if there was any moon, was to linger at the window and note how the shadows lent another kind of beauty to the garden that he loved. So it happened that about a month after his arrival in Dashden, he was watching the garden by moonlight when he noticed a dark patch on the wall between two trained pear trees. The wall was whitewashed to reflect the sun's rays, and the patch looked just as if some water had been thrown on the place. Father Thornton mentally remarked that the gutter of the house must be choked and the rainwater running down the wall. In the morning, as soon as he had said Mass, eaten his breakfast and said some office, he went out to attend to the matter. The patch had disappeared, and the supposed damp had vanished, which was only to be expected, seeing that the sun was shining hotly on the wall. And then it dawned on the priest that there was no gutter to overflow on the wall, so his explanation fell to the ground. But of course it was possible that some water had been thrown there. It was not worth thinking about any further. That same morning his housekeeper complained that she had slept badly and had been plagued by dreams that someone was walking about the garden and sobbing. Father Thornton told her to take no notice of dreams, and added a word or two on the subject of tinned lobster and toasted cheese for supper. He also inquired if, by any chance, she had thrown water on the wall, but she knew nothing about it. It seems to have been about a week later that he noticed the same thing, but the mark looked a little darker than before. This time he watched it for some minutes and fancied that it moved, but this was obviously pure fancy. In the morning he again looked at the place, and this time he searched for any inequality in the brickwork, or for any minute growth of mould on the wall that might show up when the light fell on it at a certain angle. But nothing at all came of the investigation. But it was an odd coincidence that the housekeeper had complained of another disturbed night. The next night Father Thornton saw the dark patch again, but this time it looked much more like a shadow. Yet there was no object standing between the wall and the rising moon that could have thrown such a shadow. He watched it for some minutes, till again he thought that it moved, when he very sensibly said to himself that it was quite time to go to bed. Then the weather changed, and for 3 weeks the nights were dark and overcast, so that there was no temptation for the priest to linger at the window when he went to bed. But the housekeeper still complained of disturbing dreams, always connected with the garden, and this was supported by the testimony of an elderly lady of biblious habits, who said that on one night she was passing on her way home she heard sound like a man moaning in the garden, but as she added that her poor legs gave way under her and the stones of the street rose up and struck her in the face, Father Thornton formed his own conclusions about it. But he began to have very serious doubts when the weather improved and the nights became clear again, for by this time the affair seemed to have developed. The moon was shining brightly, and every detail in the garden could be seen almost as well as in daytime. Where the vague patch had been seen on the wall now stood a shadow, and it had assumed definite shape. It was clearly the shadow of a man. It stood out sharply. There was no question about it. But where was the man who cast the shadow? There was no one in the garden, and this time the shadow moved. There was not the least question that it moved. It was no merely trifling appearance of motion which might have been put down to imagination. The shadow moved from one side of the pear tree to the other. Father Thornton was now so sure that there was someone in the garden that he opened his window and called out. There was no reply, but at that moment a cloud obscured the moon, and when the light came again, the shadow on the wall had gone. Next morning the housekeeper gave notice. She said she liked the place well enough and was sorry to go, but she could not stand being disturbed every night. She believed there was something queer about the place, and that the former housekeepers had not left for nothing. She would be glad to go as soon as someone could be found to take her place. Father Thornton's persuasions were useless. Even an offer of increased wages had no effect. So there was nothing for it but to look out for someone else, and in the meantime to wonder why all the other housekeepers had left. The next few nights the priest was so much occupied in the evenings that he was too tired to watch at the window, but when he next did he saw a further development. The shadow, which now appeared more substantial, if one may so speak of a shadow, was in its usual place, but while he watched it moved away and apparently went down the path until it passed out of sight behind a group of shrubs. Father Thornton rubbed his eyes, made sure that he was awake, and watched to see what would happen next. But nothing further occurred, and he went to bed thoroughly puzzled. Then came a further spell of wet weather and overcast skies, and it was not until about a week later that anything more happened. It was a bright moonlight night, and the priest found himself once more at the window about 10 o'clock. This time he saw not a shadow, but a man standing by the wall. His face was turned away, but he appeared to be a man of middle life, and with his head a little bent and his arms folded. Father Thornton was just about to call out to him when he moved slowly away and disappeared behind the shrubs, as the shadow had done previously. The moon shone brightly on him, so that he was clearly seen, and his movements were quite natural and unconstrained, and yet it seemed to the watcher that there was something unusual about him. It was not until Father Thornton was thinking the matter over in the morning that it dawned upon him what this was. The man cast no shadow. The moon was shining clearly, but it shone right through the man. His body offered no obstruction to the light. This was distinctly startling and rather disquieting. A trespasser in the garden at night was unwelcome enough, but could be warned off if he came again. But what can one do with a man who casts no shadow? Next night Father Thornton went to his window only just in time to see the intruder disappear behind the shrubs. He ran down without a moment's delay and out to the garden, but no one was there. On his return to his room he watched for the next half hour, but nothing occurred. But in the morning the housekeeper said that she really must leave that same week, for she could not stand any more of such nights as the last. According to her story, she had been wakened up again and again with the idea that someone was groaning in the garden. For 2 or 3 nights nothing further happened, and then the priest once more saw the man standing by the wall. This time he adopted fresh tactics. He ran downstairs, out by the sacristy door to the road, along the outside of the wall, and then went in very softly through a small door at the bottom of the garden. He was thus able to get behind the shrubs where the man without a shadow had disappeared on the previous occasions. There he waited for his coming. It could hardly be said that he felt quite at ease, but neither was he particularly nervous. He was just curious to see what would happen. Presently he heard soft footsteps approaching, and peering through the branches of a shrub, he saw the mysterious visitor walking slowly towards him. The man had his arms folded and his head so much bent that his face could not be seen. He came up to the shrubs, turned the corner, and then Father Thornton suddenly stepped out of the shadow and stood in his track. The priest told a friend afterwards that it was rather difficult to explain exactly what then occurred. The intruder vanished, but the method of his going was peculiar. He did not disappear like a flash, neither did he sink into the earth. It was more as if a blind had been suddenly pulled down in front of him. The upper part of him seemed to vanish just a second before the rest of him. This was not exactly it, but Father Thornton said it was the nearest way he could describe it. Anyway, the man vanished before it was possible to speak to him or even to see his face. To say that the watcher was taken aback is to put it too mildly. He was simply staggered. Up till now he had not regarded the affair as out of the normal. Even the fact that the intruder cast no shadow, though it puzzled him, had not left any great impression on his mind. But now he was forced to face the fact that the visitor was, well, he did not know quite what to think. He recalled the story about the man who had once lived there and was said to have deprived his dying wife of the consolations of the church, and he did not at all like it. Still, what could he do? There was nothing for it but to await events, and the events soon arrived. A few days later, the new housekeeper, for the old one had gone, told Father Thornton that she had seen some man in the garden while he was in church, and had hurried out to ask who it was, but had been only just in time to see him pass behind the group of shrubs, and when she looked there, he was gone. A similar tale came from a farmer who was driving by in a high cart at night and could see over the wall. He noticed the man and mentioned the matter in case it should be anyone after the fruit. It was clear from this that the intruder was visible to other people beside the priest, and this excluded his idea that perhaps it might be a delusion on his part. If other people could see the stranger, it was clear that he really existed outside the imagination of one person. The thing could not now be brushed aside as mere fancy, or at best as a mere mental impression which might or might not have some intelligible meaning, and things that are really existent have to be faced and dealt with. But still, what was there to do? On Saturday night came a fresh and very significant development. Father Thornton was in his confessional as usual, and the last of the little waiting group of penitents had just made his confession. The priest was about to leave when he saw a man enter the church and come hurrying up as if fearing to be too late. He was a tall man, muffled in a black cloak, and he walked with his head so bowed that his face could not be seen. He was a complete stranger to the place, and yet Father Thornton could not help fancying that he had somewhere seen him before. He came quickly up and entered the confessional. The slight vibration as he knelt down could be distinctly felt. The priest opened the shutter and murmured the usual blessing. Then he heard the opening words of the Confiteor said in a muffled voice, and then the voice suddenly ceased. He said quietly, "Yes, go on." But there was no reply. Father Thornton at once left his seat and went round to the side of the confessional, fearing that the man had fainted or been taken suddenly ill. There was nobody there. Nor was there anyone in the church, for the other people had now gone. Then it flashed upon Father Thornton where he had seen the man before. It was the intruder in the garden, the man who cast no shadow. What could this possibly mean? It certainly looked as if this was some unquiet spirit, condemned to haunt the place for his sins and anxious to confess them and obtain forgiveness. But could such a thing possibly be? And what could a priest do in such a case, supposing it to exist? Could he give absolution to a ghost? Suppose the man came again and managed to make his confession. He would have to do something. He had better consult the bishop without delay. And yet, how could he expect the bishop to believe such an impossible story? It would not be very pleasant to have that excellent prelate thinking him insane, or perhaps wondering if he was strictly sober in the evening. It was a bit awkward that all these strange events had all happened at night. When he went into the house, the new housekeeper had a queer story to tell. According to her, she was just returning from an errand to a shop when she saw a rather tall man, wrapped in a black cloak, enter the church. There was nothing remarkable about that, but the queer thing was that the door was closed, and the man went right through it. Of course, Father Thornton told her not to talk nonsense, but she persisted in her story. She was quite sure that she saw the man walk right up to the closed door, and then he seemed to melt into it. And she went on to express the opinion that it must be the devil, and to say that if there were to be any goings-on of that sort, she would never be able to sleep at night. It did not look very promising for the future. It would be too bad to have another housekeeper take herself off through this puzzling business. But the end of it came about a week later, and the mystery was as nearly solved as it will ever be in this world. The winter had come suddenly, and a heavy snowstorm had taken the world by surprise. The moors were carpeted with white, and the hoar frost on the branches glittered in the moonlight. Then a knock came at the door, and a moment later the housekeeper announced that a man wanted to see the priest. Father Thornton went to the door and found himself face to face with a tall man in a black cloak. He was not much past middle age, though the hair of his temples was turning white and his short beard was still raven black. His face was quite strange to the priest, and yet he somehow felt that he had seen him before. He spoke abruptly and awkwardly, as if doubtful of his reception. He had simply come to ask the priest to go at once to a house about 2 miles distance on the moor to give the last sacraments to a woman there. "But she is not ill," said the priest. "I saw her only yesterday, and she was perfectly well." "She was taken suddenly, only this afternoon, and the doctor says she is going fast," answered the man. "But if this is true, why did not some of her own people come and tell me?" queried the priest, who could not quite believe the tale. "For God's sake, don't delay, Father," pleaded the man. "You will only be just in time. None of them could get away, so I have come. You don't know what it means to me. Do come quickly." "Very well, then. I will come at once," said the priest, and the man instantly turned on his heel and hurried away in the direction of the cottage where the sick woman was. Father Thornton put on his heavy boots, fetched the oils and the Blessed Sacrament from the church, and proceeded to wrap himself up well to face the bleak walk across the moor. Then the housekeeper came into the room with a scared look and begged him not to go. She said that she had the creeps all the time that man was talking, and she was sure there was something queer about him. It was most likely a trick to annoy the priest. Much better wait till the morning and find out the real facts. He too had his doubts, but he felt it right to be on the safe side. How would he ever forgive himself if the woman proved to be really dying and he had not gone to her? So he set out for his long tramp through the snow. As he left the gate, he saw before him the footprints of the man who had come to fetch him. They led straight across the snow-covered moor, and the priest was glad to see them. They were like somebody's company on a lonely night, so he kept his eyes on them as he went along. Then he stopped suddenly. Could he believe his eyes, or was it imagination? The footprints in the snow ceased suddenly. The track ended there, right on the open moor. The man had walked so far, and then what had happened? He might have sprung up into the air, but if so, he never came down again, or had he melted away into the night and left no sign? Anyway, there was the expanse of untouched snow in all directions, and there were the footprints, mysteriously ended. Father Thornton confessed afterwards that it was only the thought of him whom he was carrying that gave him the courage to go on, but he pursued his way until he reached the cottage, where he was received with mingled astonishment and joy. There he learnt a little more of the strange happenings of the night. The woman had been taken ill in the afternoon, but the doctor did not anticipate any immediate danger. He said there was no need to trouble the priest till morning, but she had suddenly grown very weak, and they had fetched the doctor again. Nearly an hour before the priest's arrival, about the time when the messenger called Father Thornton, the doctor had said she was dying. The only available person at hand had started to fetch the priest, but had fallen over a log hidden in the snow and had badly strained his ankle, so that he could go no further. The poor people were in despair when Father Thornton arrived. He was only just in time, for the woman died a few minutes after receiving the last sacraments. And now, who was that messenger? The priest has often asked himself this question, and has never yet found the answer. Nor has he ever since seen the man without a shadow walking in the garden, and the housekeepers have ceased to come and go. That was Father Thornton's Visitor, from Ghost Gleams by W J Wintle. William James Wintle was born in 1861 and died in 1934. He was a journalist and writer. Towards the end of his life, he dedicated himself to God and became an oblate at the Benedictine Abbey on Caldy Island in Wales. He liked telling ghost stories to the boys of the Abbey's school. This story, and the others in the collection, were published in 1921. I hope you enjoyed this gentle ghost story. And as always, thank you for listening.